Okay, I see we have some folks here, so I'm going to go ahead and get started. Let's see, can people hear me? Jared, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes. Okay. Well, hello, everybody. I'm Dr. Maria Lisa Christie at the Center of International Research, Education, and Development at Virginia Tech. Welcome to our Global Development Discussion Series. Thanks to Continuing in Professional Education for co-sponsorship this year. We're so happy you could join for today's discussion featuring Dr. Cheryl Doss as guest speaker. The title of her talk is Does Women's Empowerment Mediate Household Food Insecurity in the Event of Shocks? Evidence from Ethiopia. I am very excited to have her here as I have been following her work for 20 years and never met her until our e-meeting just a few moments ago. And I also want to thank everyone for attending the webinar today and anyone who helped us get the word out about it. So as of this morning, we had over 80 people registered for today's event. We'll see how many end up joining as we get rolling here. But that was from institutions in 12 countries in Bangladesh, Benin, Canada, China, Ecuador, Ethiopia, Germany, India, Kenya, Liberia, Switzerland, and Uganda. So that was very exciting. And besides students, faculty, and staff from Virginia Tech and Virginia Tech's Lifelong Learning Institute, we have registrants from other U.S. universities, Emory and Henry, UC Davis, University of Florida, University of Illinois, and Cornell. We also have, no surprise, many CGIAR folks, so including the International Food Policy Research Institute, better known as IFPRI, the International Livestock Research Institute, ILRI, the International Rice Research Institute, IRI, and the International Potato Center, CEAP. All those are CGIAR. But we also have folks from other development organizations, both governmental and non-governmental, including Cultural Practice, TechnoServe, Catholic Relief Services, Chorus International, Mercy Corps, Salvation Army World Support Office, the Society for International Development, or SID, Jesse Global, African Economic Research Consortium, Annabelle, Belgian Agency for International Cooperation, the Alliance for Biodiversity and SEAT in Canada, the German Development Agency for International Cooperation, Actions Transforming Lives in Liberia, and former USAID people. I'm sorry, I can't say, and also USAID. So former retirees. So some brief housekeeping notes. As you saw, if you saw the welcome slides, this event lasts approximately 45 minutes. Our speaker's presentation will be about 20-25, followed by about 20 minutes of discussion and Q&A with the audience. All participants will be muted to enable the panelists to present without interruption. During any time during this talk, you can post questions in the Zoom Q&A, and we'll read those out after the presentation. Or after the speaker's presentation, people can raise their hands through the virtual buttons, and we'll ask you to unmute yourself so you can speak directly to the speaker or to others if we have a discussion going on. But please wait your turn to speak so we avoid interruptions and maintain etiquette. If you'd like to enable captions at the bottom of your Zoom screen, you can select More, then Show Captions, and select English. And our event will be recorded, and that was in the welcome thing, and it'll be available on our website and on the Virginia Tech Library, VT Works. So a little more on our speaker. Cheryl Doss is a professor of economics at Tufts University. Her research focuses on rural transformation and gender issues in agriculture, household and intra-household decision-making, and women's ownership and control over assets, including land. Her research on methodological innovations in survey design and analysis is designed to allow richer understanding of multiple and competing voices within households. Increasingly, her work is interdisciplinary and incorporates qualitative data. Her publications span the fields of economics, agricultural economics, and development studies. She's worked with international organizations including IFPRI, the World Bank, UNDP, Food and Ag Organizations, the African Development Bank, and the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. Today, the discussion will provide an overview on the role of women's empowerment in mitigating the impacts of shock on household food insecurity in rural Oromia, Ethiopia. Please welcome our speaker.
Great. Thank you very much. I'm really delighted to be here today. And I'm really looking forward to comments and questions. We are in the very, very final stages. I've promised my co-authors that I will get them the final draft of the paper in the next few days. So glad to have any suggestions or things that aren't clear. So what we're going to look at today is this question about whether women's empowerment can um, mediate the impact of shocks on household food insecurity. And I also want to recognize my two co-authors, Maria Hillisland and Martina Carreta. If I can make this change slides. There we go. Good. So, as I'm sure most of you know, there's a long history of thinking about women's importance to food security. People have been writing on this for decades now. We know that women are producers of food as well as being involved in the processing, preparing, and allocating of food within the household, right? So, long history of work on this. More recent work has generally found a positive relationship between women's empowerment and food security. So the literature on that is pretty broad as well. It's a little bit all over the place, in part because people use really different measures of women's empowerment and very, very different measures of food security. But generally, most of the work finds a positive relationship between those two. One of the contributions of our work today is that we're going to consider women's empowerment not as being a standalone thing, but we're going to think about it in the context of her household, also considering the empowerment levels of her husband. And the other thing we do is we're going to think about the relationship between women's empowerment and food security when there's shocks. So we know that shocks generally increase food insecurity. Um, I was only able to come up with good pictures for a couple of kinds of shocks. Price shocks are harder to think about what that looks like, but it's a huge range of kinds of shocks that households face, and pretty clearly they often increase food insecurity. But the question then today is, does women's empowerment that we know can be important for food security, is it also important in these contexts with shocks? So the data that I'm going to use is data from 528 couple households in Oromia, Ethiopia. We have two rounds of data collection. So the first round was done in December of 2016 and January of 2017, and then went back 2 years later in February and March of 2019. The data was actually collected as part of an impact evaluation of the UN Joint Program on Rural Women's Economic Empowerment, but we're not going to use any of the impact evaluation kinds of things. We're just going to be using the data. We do everything with the full sample, controlling for program participation, but then we also run the regressions and do that with just the control sample as well, which gives us basically the same results. So we're not going to talk about the impact evaluation piece of it. What we're able to do, I'm just going to give you the quick overview now to give you a sense of what we're doing. In the initial round, we asked people questions about empowerment, questions to both the husband and the wife in the household using the project level Women's Empowerment in Agriculture Index. So we have initial levels of empowerment of the husband and wife. We also administer the FIAS, the Household Food Insecurity Experience Scale, in the initial round. When we go back 2 years later, we asked lots of other things too, of course, but we asked if the household experienced any shocks and we re-administer the FIAS. So what we're able to do is look at whether the change in household food insecurity, how that's related to them having experienced shocks and to the empowerment levels of the husband and wife in the household. So, just a little bit on the context of where this is. These are rural households that rely on agriculture for their livelihoods. Um, the region was experiencing a drought at the time of the first survey round. So, we're not, in some sense, we are looking at specific new shocks that happened over this 2 year period, but things were not particularly good at the initial point. It's poor, fairly marginalized communities. More than a third of the men and about 70% of the women are illiterate. About 10% of the households have tap water, either in their dwelling or on their compound, and 24% have electricity. Almost all of them report living in homes with earth, dirt, or sand floors. So that just gives you a sense of the context in which we're working. So what I need to do now is tell you about the three kinds of measures, three kinds of data that we're going to be using. So the first one is the women's empowerment data. And as I said, we're using the pro-WEAI. The pro-WEAI thinks about three kinds of agency. So the pro-WEAI is part of the family of women's empowerment in agriculture indices. This one was designed specifically for impact evaluation. So thinking about it at that kind of a level of a set of communities and trying to think about changes over time in empowerment. Three types of agency: intrinsic agency, which we often think about as the power within, kind of whether you have the self-confidence to be able to make changes in your life. Collective agency, which is the power with, working with others to accomplish things. And then instrumental agency, which is the one that most development programs actually typically work on and think about. So your ability to do things. And here's the basic levels of empowerment that we find at the beginning in our baseline survey. So the ones to notice first are the ones in blue. Those are the ones where men's empowerment is higher than women's on average. And particularly notice that that's in terms of work balance. 80% of men, but only 38% of the women are empowered in this particular dimension. And also men have a much higher share of men are empowered than women. So 70% of men, but only 55% of women are empowered in this sample. The ones highlighted in green are the ones where women are more empowered than men. So in input in productive decisions, but also in control over use of income. And so these are these real differences, not just in the levels of empowerment between men and women, but in which dimensions of empowerment they're empowered in, is gonna matter for our trying to understand what we see in our results. What we do with this data is we're going to create four household types. We're going to look at households where both are empowered, where neither is empowered, where only the wife or only the husband is empowered. So to think about what the wife's empowerment, women's empowerment, not just alone, but also how does that relate to whether or not her husband is empowered. Of our households, 228 of them, both are empowered, but we have 61, which was a little surprising to us, in which the wife is empowered and the husband is not. We also have 97 where neither are, and then much more common for the husband to be empowered and the wife not to be empowered than the other way around. So what kinds of shocks did these households experience? So I'm showing you this data by these four different household categories: neither, only husband, only wife, or both empowered. Just looking at the graph before I tell you much about the shocks, you ought to be able to see that the big story is across the different types of shocks rather than differences across households, the different household types. There's some differences across household types. We first look at whether households experienced any type of shock. So whatever kinds of shocks, if they reported any kinds of shocks, and about 30% of our households reported experiencing a shock during those 2 years between the first round and the second round. We then categorize most of the shocks into one of three types. The first one is agricultural shocks, which could be shocks to either crop production or livestock production, loss of animals, loss of crops. The second one is the increases in prices, and that could be either increases in input prices for the things that they're purchasing for their agricultural production, or it could be consumer prices, particularly food prices, and food prices were going up at this time. And the third category of shocks is health shocks, which are either a serious illness of someone in the household or the death of a household member. So those three are almost all of the things that people reported as any shock. There were a few people who reported theft and a few people who reported loss of jobs, but basically those three capture most of them. We also were interested in sort of in thinking about all the literature on dealing with shocks and whether communities are able to insure each other and how people kind of their own risk networks, we thought it would be useful to compare idiosyncratic shocks. Those were just that household had a shock and not everybody else with covariate shocks. And to categorize these, we counted all health shocks as idiosyncratic shocks. Um, that wouldn't be true during the pandemic, but it was true during this particular time period in Ethiopia. There was not kind of systematic health issues across the communities. So those were idiosyncratic. All of the increases in prices we treated as covariate shocks. Everybody experienced those. That wasn't all of the communities talked about that when people talked about price shocks. And then for agricultural shocks, we treated them as covariate shocks if 48% or more of the people in the community reported having agricultural shocks. So those agricultural shocks were widespread. We treated them as idiosyncratic shocks if 20% or fewer experienced agricultural shocks. We didn't have anybody in that middle category, so it was really clear to how to separate those two out. So we have those two groups that we're going to look at as well. Then we need to think about our food insecurity measure. What we're going to use is the FIAS, the Food Insecurity Experience Scale. And basically, this is a scale asking about people's experiences with regard to food and the lack of food. Households that get reported as being moderately food insecure, that means that at times they may have needed to reduce the quantity as well as the quality of food that they would normally eat. And households experiencing severe food insecurity would have gone for extended periods of time without eating. In our survey, in the initial round, 48% of the households experienced either moderate or severe food insecurity. In the second round, it was a little bit lower at 45%. So things were a little bit better for some people, although households that did not experience a shock were on average 10% less likely to experience moderate to severe food insecurity in the second round than those who did experience the shock between those. So we do see, as we would expect, that having a shock makes you more likely to be more food insecure in the second round. We're going to actually use the full continuous variable of the food insecurity scale, not just whether they're moderate or severely food insecure. And then we're going to look at changes in their index of food insecurity. So for those of you who like to see an equation in a presentation, here's the one that you're going to get. This is our empirical strategy, pretty much what I just told you earlier. We're going to look at the changes in food insecurity from over the time period, whether the household is empowered. So one of those four, are they both empowered, neither empowered, wife only, or husband only? Then shocks, and we'll use different specifications using any shock or the various different types of shock. And then an interaction term between the empowerment and the shock variables. We also have a vector of household characteristics in the initial survey, pretty standard kinds of things, as well as thinking about the changes in household size and the number of children under age 5 over the 2-year period. We control for fixed effects in the woreda, and we also control for whether or not the households were members of the program. So let's look at the results. This one is going to show us the impact of experiencing any kind of shock on food insecurity. And what we see is that on the left two sides, for neither and only husband, we see that when there's a shock, it increases the probability of food insecurity. But when either only the wife or both, so when the wife is empowered, we see that having the shock has no change in the probability of food insecurity, suggesting that at least at this level, right, women's empowerment is mediating the impact of shocks on food insecurity. We can then look at this in terms of the other, specifically thinking about other types of shocks or categorizing them as three types. And what we see again on the left, for agricultural shocks and health shocks, we actually see that those don't have any impact on food insecurity. So experiencing an agricultural shock or a health shock does not make you more likely to be more food insecure in the second round. But with the price shocks, we do see an increase in food insecurity, and we see increase in food insecurity, an increase in the probability of food insecurity, to be technically correct, um, for all of the types of households except those in which only the wife is empowered. So if only the wife is empowered, she is able to mediate the impact of price shocks on household food insecurity. And then again, we can look at divide it up this other way, thinking about covariate and idiosyncratic shocks. Here with idiosyncratic shocks on the right, we see no impact of food insecurity, no change in food insecurity, in the probability of food insecurity because of an idiosyncratic shock, which says that people probably are, in some sense, insuring each other and taking care of each other in the community to some extent. When there's a covariate shock, when the woman is empowered, either only the wife or both, then we again see that she's able to mediate the impact, and there's no impact of the shock on food insecurity. Whereas if she's not empowered, and it's either neither or only the husband, then food insecurity is worse after the shock. So there's lots of reasons why this might be the case. So we thought we would also look at the coping strategies that they used to try to understand a bit about what's going on. And we do see some pretty significant differences in the coping strategies that were used. People were asked to list up to 3 coping strategies that they used to deal with the shock if they said that they had experienced one. The main strategy that all the households use, or yeah, pretty much, is to sell livestock. So again, it's I think useful to remember that these people were already had been experiencing a drought before we initially talked to them, and then had an additional shock after the drought. Um, and so selling livestock is a coping strategy. It's also one that can make them worse off in the long run. But we see that all the households did that. But we see that the households in which only the wife was empowered was much more likely to use savings, which is interesting. That means suggests those households have some savings, um, but also more likely than the other kinds of households to receive help from friends or family. So somewhat different patterns depending on who's empowered within the household. We also see a little bit of difference just in the number of coping strategies that were used. So we asked people to list up to 3. Only a few people listed 3, so we think that that was fine to only ask about 3. We're not missing something important that they didn't tell us in their 4th, 5th, or 6th ones. But what we do notice is that when only the wife was empowered, they're more likely to use 2 coping strategies than any of the other types of households. So let's think a little bit about what we think this means. What are the implications? So what I've just shown you is that women who are empowered are able to mediate the impact of shocks on household food insecurity, and that when households have experienced any shock or covariate shocks, those worsen food insecurity in those households where the wife is not empowered, right? And again, there's no impact of price shocks when only the woman is empowered. So what do we think is going on? Let me say that we were a little bit surprised by the price shocks one. We had expected that having women empowered in the household might mediate the shocks, but we thought that having both people in the household empowered would be better than having only the woman empowered. That kind of household dynamics when they're both empowered would be better and that they would be better able to deal with the shocks. We do see that that's not necessarily better, but that when both of them are empowered, that mitigates the shocks as well for some of these types of shocks, but not for price shocks. So what do we think is going on with price shocks? Well, one of it may be that women are more likely to be empowered in the dimension of control over income, right? And so it seems to be, or at least the story would be consistent with that. When women are more empowered and they have control over income, and particularly when they have control over income and their husband says that he does not have control over income, they're able to use that control over income to protect food security. We also see a bit that the coping strategies differ across households, and we don't have a way with the data that we've got to be able to really show that that's what's causing it. But certainly the patterns that we see are suggestive that different coping strategies, um, the different households are different types of households are using different strategies, and so that may be part of the story. And so again, this bigger part of the story is that we're looking at men's and women's empowerment and asking whether the men and women, the husband and wife in the households are empowered, but they're empowered in different dimensions. And so it may be that the dimensions that women are empowered in are the ones that they're really being able to take advantage of and use to protect their food security. I want to just put in two caveats. This first one I think is really important, which is that we're only measuring one kind of welfare outcome, food security. Food security is a really important welfare outcome, but certainly not the only one. So, although we can say that having the women be empowered really matters, and that in this one case, we see that not having the men empowered helps to protect against price shocks, we actually don't know about other outcomes. And so we don't have the data to look at whether both of them being empowered may be associated with other kinds of positive outcomes. So that it may be also good for the household in other kinds of ways. And then just finally, I would note that this is a very particular context with very high levels of food insecurity in the initial round as well as in the later round. And so I would be really interested to look at some of these kinds of issues in other contexts as well. But I think part of the takeaway is that we really gain something more when we don't just look at women's empowerment on its own, but put it in the context of thinking about whether the woman's empowered, but also whether the man is empowered in the household. And I will stop there.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Cheryl. And now the discussion starts, and I'm going to read the first question from a student at UC Davis, who is in a quiet study room. So Anna Cepeda asks, are loans only granted to men? I noticed that when none or both are empowered, loans are a coping strategy.
No, so that one's a little bit complicated because part of this project that was being implemented in the area was providing loans. There are loans, women were able to take out loans. The project didn't actually work all that well in this area. Um, and some people who initially had credit lost credit. But certainly it wasn't the case that only men were accessing loans.
Well, somebody gets brave and asked to unmute themselves. I have a question.
Okay.
So I'm wondering how, it's really a broader question, it's kind of more of a discussion, but how has your work incorporated qualitative data? What are some of the benefits? What have been some of the pushbacks? I mean, you're an economist, right? I do qualitative research, working with mixed methods and, working with ag economists, but over and over we get, oh, that's just stories. So where's the data, right? So I just wonder if you can say how you've managed over your career. Has this changed? And that's the topic. I'll stop.
That is a big topic. I would just Yes, I've thought lots about qualitative data. One of my co-authors, Dee Rubin, who's I think on the call or listening in, she and I have a paper where we've looked at how qualitative and quantitative data used together has really changed how we think about women's empowerment. Looking back over, I think we talk about 15 years and a number of different projects where um, I think one of the things that we argue in that paper is that having long-term relationships between people doing qualitative and quantitative work really makes a difference so that you have these iterative back and forth conversations where you try out something, the quantitative data tells you one thing, and then the qualitative data maybe tells you something different. And so you have to go back to the quantitative data and try to figure out what's the story. And we have a number of examples in that paper of where we really learned some new things from putting those two kinds of data together. So we don't have very much of it. We don't have much qualitative data in this particular paper, but most of my work has. I've incorporated more. But I mean, I certainly, as an economist, I talk to other economists who say, "Oh yeah, we commissioned a qualitative report and they did it and they sent it to us, and so we've got some qualitative work, right?" I'm sure you've experienced that. But I think it's really those deep conversations over and over, back and forth, trying things out that really kind of it shapes the new questions that come out.
Okay, I'm gonna ask. Let's see, we have a bunch of questions, but they're coming in two different places, so they're kind of hard. But Bernice, do you want to ask your question, or do you want me to read it? Unmute yourself if you want to ask it directly. If I don't hear from you, I'm going to go ahead and read it. Okay, so let's see, Bernice. Well, let's see. Okay, Tesfaye, do you want to ask your question?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Oh,
Okay,
I
Bernice is
was
on. Okay,
muted before,
then
so
next let's have Tesfaye. Okay, go ahead, Bernice.
yeah, great presentation. Thank you so much. And I really got excited because this is something I'm particularly interested into when it comes to empowerment. So, um, I was, well, the question is purely economical. Given that the coping strategies you mentioned um gives different outcomes, I was wondering if at any point you accounted for the possibility of an endogeneity between their empowerment as an agency and then the food security, and what a possible mediating factor could be outside of the variables you considered.
so we haven't thought about other mediating factors. I think with the endogeneity, what we're looking at, so we're looking at changes in food security or food
Okay,
insecurity, but we're using initial levels of empowerment. So we're thinking about how people's empowerment in that initial stage affects their food security 2 years later. So there
okay.
could be some back and forth, right? It could be that
Hmm.
food security could change people's empowerment. We do not have the empowerment data in the second round, so we don't look at
Got it.
changes. We don't look at changes in
Changes.
empowerment.
Okay.
That would be interesting as well, but that wasn't collected. But we do, so we think we can argue that there's some causality between the empowerment and the changes
Hmm.
in food security because we're just looking at the initial empowerment levels. We're not looking at changes in empowerment.
Changes. Okay. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Okay, I just sent a message to Tesfaye. Let's see. Are you going to speak or shall I read it? Let me go ahead and ask that question. Assuming a baseline and follow-up survey, the FIAS scores at baseline and follow-up were the scales calibrated to ensure that a common scale for the items in the two surveys? I'm going to read.
Read that again. I'm
Yeah, I think it's got some typos, but so I'm not sure how to correct it because I don't understand the question. Assuming a baseline and follow-up survey, the FIES scores at baseline and follow-up were the scales calibrated to assure that a common scale for the items, probably that there was a common scale for the items in the two surveys.
so I guess I'm not understanding the question right.
Maybe we
It's
can
the
get,
s- it's the same it's the same survey in the two rounds, right? It's the same questions. And so there's two ways that people use the FIAS. One is where they just add up the number of things that the kind of just add up the indices, and then there's a more complicated way that you do more econometric modeling of it to look at the probability scores. I don't want to try to explain that without slides, and I don't have a slide that does that. But we've used that. I'm happy to send the details on it. But we're using basically the same approach for measuring food insecurity in the baseline and the second round.
So can you hear me? I'm sorry. Can you hear
Yes,
me?
yes.
Okay, thank you. So yeah, if you were using the probabilistic approach, are you using the probabilistic
Right.
approach or
Yes.
okay? Okay. So my question is, the two scores should have some common support so that they are comparable. This is from I used to work for a USAID project that before the demise. So we used to have like FIAS scores, a lot, to compare over time. So what we did was we kind of did talk to Carlo Cafiero, who is at UNFAO, who I think was involved in developing the FIAS in R. So what he told us was that we need to have a common support so that both are comparable. So that was my question, basically.
I don't know what you mean by a common support.
Because the two the two surveys were collected at different times in points. So my assumption is you use the rush model in R. Am I right?
I did not calculate this. My co-author calculated it, so I don't
Okay,
know all the
okay,
details of
that's
it.
fine. Because yeah, that's fine. Then I will stop, because it's basically you have to use the rush model to calculate the FIAS scores, and due to the difference in timing,
Okay.
there are so many factors that could change, because this is an attitude. I mean, it's just so well. That's from my experience in the past while I was working for a USAID project, which was like we had FIAS scores at different times in points. So we need to have some kind of the scores should be comparable.
Okay.
Yeah, yeah.
I'll go have a conversation with my co-authors and see what we've done and if there's more that we need to do on it.
Okay, thank you so much. Thank you.
thank you. So the next question, I may just go ahead and read the question if you don't answer right away, because I want to have the time for all these questions. So Chavi, do you want to speak your question? Maybe just comment. Okay, so I'm going to read the question from Chavi Tiwari is, did you also look at the food insecurity at the baseline, and if and how that changed?
Yes, what we're looking at is the change in food insecurity from the baseline to the second survey. So how much did food insecurity change over that time period? That's the measure that we're using. Right. So we're not just saying our household's food insecure in the second round after the shock, but we're looking at for that household, how much did food insecurity change?
Okay, thank you. Thank you so much. And I may have missed that in the beginning because I joined a bit late. But yes, I'm really excited about this research, Dr. Doss, and we have a similar kind of research, and your results validates what we are finding. So if when it gets published, if it's possible to share, that will be uh, awesome, because we are also looking at women empowerment in Ethiopia and its effect on food insecurity during the Tigray war and like what
Okay.
happened. So we are also finding the importance of livestock and women empowerment as a protective factor against food security. So this was really good.
I would love to see what you're doing. So when you've
Yeah.
got something, please send it to me. I'd be
Okay.
really, really, really interested.
Yeah. We just finished that first draft of the paper. So yeah. Okay.
Great.
Saul, would you like to ask a question?
Yeah, sure. So I was just struck by the language that you were using, talking about people as empowered or not empowered. And I just wanted to sort of ask you to tell me or think about the idea of empowerment as a kind of on-off duality rather than empowerment as a continuity, and why you chose that approach in your analysis. I mean, it seems that it covers over a lot of things. The differential in what we might mean by men's empowerment versus women's empowerment, for example, or the ways that we might not have a linear relationship, that there might be some level of empowerment that helps with food insecurity, and then above that, it may actually have a negative impact. I mean, there's just a whole bunch of questions that get raised by treating empowerment as an on-off rather than a continuum across multiple measures. So I just wanted to hear your thinking about that.
So certainly, I mean, I completely agree with you that empowerment's much more complicated than we've done it here. I think the reason we did it this way is because we wanted to be able to think about one way to do it would be to think about just the difference in men's and women's empowerment within the household and see if that matters. But we think it's not just the difference, but also the levels, right? Which is a little bit what you're saying. And so by being able to categorize households as these four types, then we can actually look at it. Then empirically, it's fairly straightforward to look at the differences. So there's a lot of nuance that we're not able to pick up. But we think that, I mean, part of what we're really saying in the paper, one of our strong points is that we need to think not just about women's empowerment, but also to think about men's empowerment within the household. And didn't want to just put them in as well, we could have put them each in as separate continuous variables with some kind of right with their empowerment score from the pro-WEAI. But that doesn't capture the relationship between them, right? That we think that there's something different in households where they're both empowered versus both not empowered. And sure, there's a lot of right. It's those choices of where you say empowered versus disempowered are arbitrary. And I will certainly grant you that. And lots of other ways to look at it, and love to see other people looking at it in other kinds of ways. But I think we thought that these four categories really helped us to think about those relationships within households in a way that there wasn't another approach that let us do that.
So I have a question, but I realize that your study perhaps wouldn't have addressed this, but in your PowerPoint, and actually, I actually did research with IPM Innovation Lab in Oromia also that involved women and livestock, cattle in particular. And so I see that, the coping strategy of selling livestock is one of women's and also joint men and women's strategies. But it concerns me that, then and you actually mention it with, then they can, how does that strategy rebound if they've sold all their livestock? It's kind of scary if that's, if that's like one of the important strategies for women. Any thoughts on that?
Well, that was an important strategy for everybody, and I think that is a problem, right? There are coping strategies that really leave you worse off, and there's some that may not leave you worse off. I don't think we're in a position in this paper to try to think about the long-term implications of this. But we do worry, right? You do worry about a place where you see that many people selling off livestock.
I mean, I really appreciate that you're looking at, of course, men and women's, but it's just in our work, and then looking at even some of the just older surveys in Ethiopia, cows and dairy are like one of women's few coping strategies, few assets, let's say. So not studies on it being used as a coping strategy. So that's why it's scary.
Right, right.
We still have 15 minutes, maybe 10 for questions. Maria has, oh good. Okay, Maria, you want to unmute yourself? No, can't unmute. Okay, I'm going to read it. So I was interested in the higher use of savings for women empowered households. Are women more likely to be involved in savings groups in Oromia?
I'm looking at my numbers here. So I don't have that number of whether they're maybe. No. So there are savings groups and there are savings groups for women in these areas. But I don't know. I could have to go back and see if we can figure that out in the data, whether women are more likely to be in a savings group than men. So that's a great question.
Great. Thank you. Yeah,
Yeah.
so I work in similar projects where we do a lot of women empowerment and savings groups connection. So I was curious to see if that was part of, maybe why the women empowered households had a higher relative use of savings when the shocks came.
Good. I'll go and try to play with that a little bit and see if I can come up with a better answer.
Thank you.
Any other questions?
Okay, so Deborah Rubin, I don't know if you're still in a car. If you can unmute yourself, go ahead. Otherwise, I'm going to read this.
I'm not in the car. And thank you, Cheryl. This was a great presentation and very clearly presented, even for me, the qualitative researcher. I'm really curious about whether there was access to livestock risk insurance in this area, and if so, whether both men and women used it, and if you had any information about its effects on food security. I realize that's not the major part of this particular paper, but part of the context.
I don't think so. I haven't heard any conversations about livestock risk insurance in these particular communities, but I will check that out too. See if I don't think we have any data on it, but I can ask colleagues who are working there.
Thanks.
Well, this is called a discussion series for a reason. So if anybody would like to say something and not just grill Cheryl Doss, you're welcome to mute yourself and have any comments.
I'm happy to share that. So I'm a practitioner, not a researcher, and this is one of the, I actually really appreciate this study and how practical in terms of those of us who are practitioners can read it and understand it, or at least the presentation a lot more than, sometimes some of the other ones. And, we use a lot of like the FIES and we use a lot of these tools and measurements. So kind of being able to see some of these correlations is really helpful.
Good. I'm really glad.
Amanda Crump, UC
Hi.
Davis, unmute yourself, please.
All right, I think I did. Okay, great. Good to see you, Cheryl, and everybody, well, kind of seeing you. So I just had a clarifying question about the women, especially the households in which the women are the empowered folks. Are like, and I'm not really that familiar with Ethiopia, but are the are the household structures all the same, or are we talking about women that may be widows? Because I ask because in some of the research from Chesney McCumber on the community concept drawings where they were defining empowerment, they were finding that in some cultural contexts, more empowered women were actually ones who had lost their husband, and like the community offers some of that empowerment support. And so I might have missed it, but I just wondered about household structure, or is there like more than one wife in some of these situations, and does that impact the empowerment of those women?
Good. These are all couple households.
Okay.
So there's not widows in the households, or they're not widows being interviewed. They're all households where we've interviewed both the man and the woman so that we have information on the man's empowerment as well as the woman's empowerment. We did do a little bit trying to look at those households where the women were empowered and trying to figure out if there was something really substantially different about them. And there's a little bit of stuff, but there wasn't something where we could say, oh, wow, these are all households in which this particular characteristic was happening. So, but they are all couple households.
Cool. Yeah, that was my main question, is just drawing on that work from Chesney was just really interesting. When like the community defines empowerment, it really shifts the conversation about what empowerment means. And so kind of away from the way we define it through the WEAI. So yeah, very, very fascinating. Thanks.
I did some work years ago where we're looking at asset ownership in Uganda, and was really surprised by the finding that widows were more likely to own land than other women. That was the category of women most likely to own land, which didn't make sense of a lot of the qualitative work and the stories that we were hearing out of these areas, where we were hearing about women who became widows being dispossessed and various other things. And what we finally decided was that part of what was going on is that the only widows who show up in a survey are the ones who have been able to stay on their land.
Oh, yeah.
And so it's the fact that they can stay on their land means that they show up in the survey. And the other widows, the ones who were dispossessed of their land, may have left the communities. They may be living in somebody else's household, right? Moving in with their husband's brother traditionally, and may or may not show up in our data at all. And so the women who show up are the ones who own land, and the other ones just kind of disappear.
Yeah, that makes sense. And that could be part of what's going on here too. Yeah.
Okay,
Cool.
so Jean Sumner, apparently people can't unmute themselves very easily. I'm going to ask her question.
Okay.
Yeah.
Did you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Did you control for the educational level of the women and, for that matter, the men?
We did. We controlled for education levels. The
Good.
education levels were all pretty low, but we certainly did control for them.
Thank you.
So I'm going to start wrapping up, unless somebody wants to ask another question. Raise your hand or put it in the Q&A or the chat. Okay, so I want to thank everybody for joining us. If somebody puts a question, I will stop, but I will want to thank everybody for joining us. We have just 5 minutes to go. And for Dr. Doss for presenting. Thank you for a wonderful presentation. And we're sharing a short survey. If one of my people is not putting it in the chat, then thank you, Pratiraksha, my lovely grad student, is putting in. Please respond to it to help us raise funds for future discussion series. And you'll also get it, I think, through Zoom. But your opinion is very important to us. And I also had put in earlier And I'll try to put it in again if I stop talking, how you can just add yourself or to our listserv directly. And our listserv, I always say, I don't bomb people with anything other than information about the discussion series. And you could check our website for more information to get updates on future events. Our future event would be in the fall semester on the academic year. So, and lots of thank yous on there.
Great, and thank you all for your comments and questions. I'm going to go figure out a few more of these, so that's great to do.
So here is a link.
All right, thank you.
Bye, everybody.